You know, when the world entered into the pandemic a year ago, more than a year ago, there was one immediate question coming up, which was which kind of systems would be able to deal better with crisis? Would it be authoritarian rulers? Would it be democratic rulers and system? Who could cope better with crisis and the pandemic? And that brought us to the idea in our organizing team of the Körber History Forum to organize a panel on the past and present of authoritarianism. And this is what we are up to next, starting in 1 minute here at our conference venue, with two very esteemed guests and one great moderator. We will discuss with Jan-Werner Müller of Princeton University. We'll discuss with Ruth Ben-Ghiat from New York University. And the question will be, is it that simple? And we talk about the past and present of authoritarianism and what history can teach us about crisis management, about the roots of democracy and the way forward. Constanze Stelzenmüller of Brookings Institution will moderate this debate, which we look very much forward to. And we encourage you all again to use our chat, to pose questions, to interact with our speakers. And the floor is now open to our panelists and to the debate about authoritarianism. Enjoy.
All right. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, Gabriele Voidoko. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce this great panel and to moderate it. My name, as Gabriele said, is Constanze Stelzenmüller. I hold the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations, just recently established at the Brookings Institution's Center on the US and Europe. Now, this COVID-19 pandemic that we've all been living through for the past 15 months and the political measures taken to contain it have reignited the debate on the allure of the authoritarian, quote unquote. But this is just the latest and no doubt not the last round in a series of events that go through at least a decade of disruptions, from the global financial crisis of 12 years ago onward, and which appeared to challenge the viability and legitimacy of representative democracy, including in the Western heartlands of democracy, Europe and the United States. And in this coming hour, we want to discuss the origins of this phenomenon, its impact on current politics, and how to make representative democracy more resilient. With me to discuss these questions are two illustrious panelists. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is an historian, educator, and commentator on fascism, authoritarian leaders, and propaganda. She is professor of history and Italian studies at New York University and has written several books and is a regular commentator on American media. And her newest book, Strongmen from Mussolini to the Present, which appeared last November, examines the authoritarian playbook, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss its details shortly. My second panelist is Professor Jan-Werner Müller. He's professor of politics at Princeton University, co-founder of the European College of Liberal Arts in Berlin, also author of several books and a regular commentator on current affairs in the New York Review of Books, where I started reading him, the New York Times, the Deutsche Zeitung, and others. And he's written about questions of democratic theory, the history of political ideas in the 20th century. Many of you will know his book from 2016, What is Populism, which is translated into 15 languages. And he too has a book forthcoming called Democracy Rules, if I understand correctly. Before we begin, this discussion is being translated simultaneously from English into German. And in order not to make life impossible for the translators, and that very much includes me, we need to be careful to let each other finish our sentences, which I'm sure we'll do. We'll go straight into conversation and reserve about 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience, but I might bring some in between if they fit into our train of conversation. And finally, since this is the Körber History Forum, I'll be asking us to reflect on whether the challenges we currently face are truly novel, or whether there are any lessons to be learned from history from our present predicaments. And I wanted to start us off in true academic fashion with a round on language and terminology, and go to you, Jan-Werner Müller, and ask you, what exactly do we mean by populism? In your book, What is Populism? You wrote, and I quote, "Populism arises with the introduction of representative democracy. It is its shadow. The core claim of populism is a moralized form of anti-pluralism." Can you explain this a little bit for us?
Yes, I'll try to take apart this rather highfalutin phrase by pointing out that, contrary to conventional wisdom, not everybody who, as the phrase often goes, criticizes elites or is angry at the establishment is therefore necessarily a populist who might somehow be dangerous for democracy. In fact, up until quite recently, I think any old civics textbook would have told us that keeping a close eye on the powerful is actually not dangerous at all, but is actually a sign of good democratic citizenship. So it's true that populists, especially when in opposition, tend to criticize sitting governments / the powerful. But much more important, they tend to claim that they, and only they, represent what they usually call the real people, or also the silent majority, with two, in my view, for democracy, very detrimental consequences. First, and rather obviously, they then also tend to claim that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. It's never just a policy disagreement. It's not even a disagreement about values. The point is the others are simply, to coin a phrase, crooked. And secondly, and maybe less obviously, populists are also going to claim that all those who do not fit into, or for that matter, even acknowledge and accept their ultimately symbolic construction of the supposedly real people are not properly part of the people at all, are not real Americans, are not real Germans, etc., etc. So long story short, what matters about populism, in my view, is not anti-elitism. Any of us can criticize the powerful, doesn't mean we're right, but this is not anything that is bound to be dangerous for democracy as such. It is indeed anti-pluralism, the tendency always to exclude others at the level of party politics, pretty obviously, and less obviously at the level of the citizenry themselves, where usually in the dominant far-right version of populism we have dominant in so many countries today, it's already vulnerable minorities who are going to be told you don't properly belong here, or where crowds are going to be unleashed to basically persecute these already vulnerable minorities violently.
Thank you. I think that's a really important point, that populism is not an inclusive but an exclusionary form of democracy. And also perhaps, I think it's worth, making explicit that there is a German theorist of all this from the 1930s whose name is worth mentioning in this context, Carl Schmitt.
That's a nice way of saying give us the 280 sign version of Carl Schmitt. I'll refrain from doing so and simply pick out one important point that indeed is very relevant and that in certain ways was articulated very clearly by Schmitt in the 1920s. He argued that there was the kind of regular democratic procedures that we're all familiar with, what he often derided as a kind of mechanistic, or what he also called statistical approach to democracy. In other words, where you kind of fill out a piece of paper or you pull a lever and then eventually somebody counts, a supposedly purely arithmetic version of democracy. This was contrasted by Schmitt with real democracy, which was about an almost mystical understanding of the people who could somehow, by acclamation, as they did, for instance, with Mussolini, really choose the leader in some existential, much more profound way. And if you look at what populists who lose elections today, very often, I'm not saying always, but very often tend to do, it's exactly this maneuver. Even if they actually eventually concede. I'm not going to go back to the most obvious example of this, but if you think back to the Austrian presidential election 2016, a far-right populist lost. Eventually he conceded, but not without saying that the winner, who happened to be a green professor with dubious ethnic background. I mean, how could such a person possibly legitimately win against a man of
dubious being the Dutch last name?
No, even worse than that. Something with Eastern Europe, if I recall correctly.
Oh, terrible.
Baltics, some very dodgy part of the world in the eyes of right-wing populists. So he eventually acknowledged that Alexander von der Bellen was really the president, but not without saying, it works better in German, forgive me, ist gezählt, aber nicht gewählt. So numerically he won, but he has not really been chosen by the people. And I refrain from spelling out the most recent iteration of this very maneuver. And note that even if the populists eventually concede, even if they don't incite their supporters to march against Congress, Parliament, etc., democracy is damaged because they essentially tell their supporters you can't trust the institutions. Everything is always, potentially illegitimate, etc. So even when they eventually concede, there's a cost. And again, just to be clear, of course, any of us can criticize our election systems. There's plenty to criticize, especially, but not only in the US. But there's a difference between saying, look, I'm criticizing campaign finance, I'm criticizing access to the vote, whatever it might be. There's a difference between that and saying our system is rotten because I didn't win. It's the latter that populists do, and it's the latter that is a danger for democracy.
Right. And I just want to sort of highlight one phrase that you just used because it's evocative, the silent majority, famously used by Richard Nixon and repurposed by the 45th president's ambassador to Germany, who arrived in Berlin saying that he wanted to speak for the silent majority, which unfortunately was read correctly by his German interlocutors, and led to, I think, his ambassadorship being off to a very, shall we say, conflict-laden start. I'm going to move to you, Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. As I said, you've just published this book on strongmen, Mussolini to the present. And since we are debating at the Körber History Forum, can you sort out for us the difference between 20th century authoritarianism and its re-emergence in the 21st century?
Sure. Excuse me. I did want to just say one thing. I'm very glad that Jan brought up that the anti-elitism isn't always the key thing, because I've been very struck at this faux populism, the whole rhetoric of anti-globalism, when all of these sitting leaders depend on a global, network of offshore finance, like Putin and all of the corrupt, where they siphon off their funds, and also depend on a global, the global facilitation of foreign enablers, and such as international law firms, foreign PR firms. And this has been true for 100 years, that authoritarians have needed this kind of foreign elites to prosper. So when they talk about populism, and the people, we have to factor that in. So I always want to highlight that faux populism they have. As to the question you asked, we're in such an interesting moment, including drifting toward this in the States, where we see how authoritarianism has changed so much, and the whole debate about what do we call fascism today, and do we call Trump a fascist? And I'm one of the lone people who resists calling him a fascist, although he uses plenty of techniques, as I show in my book, that cults of personality, et cetera, that date back a century. Because I think, to call things fascist today kind of can be confusing to people to understand how authoritarianism works today, which is, that they come to office through elections, which some of them did before, but they also must manipulate elections to stay there. So this is the electoral autocracy. And to what I was trying to do in my book, which has this kind of isolates these tools of rule, which is propaganda, corruption, violence, the myth of national greatness and so on, is to show exactly what changes and what stays the same. And the continuities are, are very striking, such as the personality cult. And this relates back to populism, part of it. And it's amazing how the canons of the personality cult have hardly changed at all, where the leader must be the man of the people, and yet he must be the man above all other men. So he's the everyman and the superman. And the other principle is that whereas a democratic with small d will represent the nation, the authoritarian must embody the nation. And this is why their body politics are so important. And when a couple of years ago, Matteo Salvini in Italy said, when they attack me, because he was up for corruption charges or whatever, when they attack me, it's as though they were attacking the whole nation. And that's perfect thing. That's a perfect example of the kind of thing that it is typical. So they embody the nation, and that hasn't changed. Obviously, the information technologies, mass media with social media, all of this has changed. So Modi is Instagramming his life. That's new. But many, many principles of the way that the leader positions himself and relates to the people have not changed.
And thank you for addressing the fascism point. I was going to ask you about that, but let me ask you something else. I was struck in your book by your emphasis on virility as an attribute of strongmen, yet possibly one of the currently most dangerous authoritarian politicians in Europe, at least as a woman.
Yes.
Marine Le Pen, who is running neck to neck in the polls with President Macron. The French have a national election in the spring of 2022. I think you would include strong women in that category, wouldn't you?
So I end in the conclusion of the book, I talk about how, the strongman phenomenon, a lot of them are, I think Orban is the youngest, but a lot of them are getting on. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is a kind of create a snapshot in print of this kind of phenomenon of male brutish leadership that is aging out, actually. Putin can do all the ice baths and plastic surgery he wants, but he is moving on in his life cycle, as they all are. And so I said that we will have a female-led authoritarian leading state, for sure. And of course, this is a phenomenon in the new right, including in America, you have these female personalities. Le Pen's a little bit of an exception because she originally was able to take on the mantle of the patriarch father. But I do think that the age of, so I wanted to take virility seriously in the book because I learned a huge amount in doing the research from political scientists, concepts of personalist rule, authoritarian bargains, many, many things. But many of political scientists don't really take masculinity seriously. And so I wanted to rank it, wanted to rank it up there with corruption and violence as a tool of rule because it enables everything. So for example, make it concrete, the kind of superman, everyman, it's also the man who gets away with things. So the authoritarian leader is the man who is above the law and gets away with it. And so this connects very obviously to corruption. It connects to violence. So the book looks at how these tools are interlinked. That's very important. And virility is kind of at the center. So when we get to the phase of, when we get to the phase of which we are perhaps entering with Le Pen having female leaders, obviously she won't be stripping her shirt off and showing her pecs and doing this exact kind of body politics. But alas, all of the other tools of rule, the corruption, the racism, the exclusionary dynamics that Jan was pointing out, all of those will remain. So that's another change versus continuity that we can keep track of.
Well, I mean, maybe one way of sort of bridging the male-female point here is to point out that male and female authoritarians alike position themselves within a sort of very traditional sort of moral universe of
Yes.
female and male roles, but notably, notably violate them in personally. I mean, another example is the AfD leader Alice Weidel, who's married to a woman, and yet is one of the leading figures of a party that espouses extremely traditional images of femininity. But let's move. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I just want to say this kind of hypocrisy, if you want to call it that, I don't know if that's the right word, has always been a mark of these rulers, because if you think of the leaders who have been very effective at allying with religious institutions, such as from Mussolini to Trump. Trump is embraced by Orthodox Jews, evangelical Christians, and these are often the most impious, profane individuals who exist. So in their personal conduct, let's say.
Right. Let's move on to the COVID-19 crisis and the question that our host asked of us at the beginning, whether this crisis has been a validation of authoritarian governance. Let me move to you, Jan-Werner. This has been a much repeated trope of this crisis. Authoritarian governments were more effective performers than democracies in combating this existential threat. Do you agree? And would you say that the crisis has undermined the legitimacy of representative democracy in the West?
Here's a funny thing. We often say that populists are those who offer, simplistic images of a very complex world. But then, with all due respect, we also want answers which ideally, can be given in 280 characters about global developments in terms of causes, consequences, and...
You're saying that for the second time. I'm not asking you for 280 character answers.
No.
As long as you want to.
I don't mean you. I think in general, it would be great to have a generalization about this. But the very boring, pedantic thing, which I'm going to say, is simply that there's so many variables in play. And so much depends on whether, let's say, a populist or an authoritarian government was faced with this kind of opposition or that kind of opposition, whether a populist party was actually in power or in opposition, that at least I find it very difficult to say anything super general about this. I think lots of people were rushing out in 2020 saying, oh, look at Trump, look at Bolsonaro. It's obvious these populists, they're anti-science. They always do simple solutions to complex problems. I don't think that populism as such is about any particular stance vis-a-vis science or universities or academia, even though very often, of course, these actors will take a kind of anti-university stance because that, signals a certain kind of anti-elitism at the same time. It's true in a limited way that both Bolsonaro and Trump defaulted into doing what, in my view, populists always do, which is to essentially wage culture war, which is to talk about unifying the people, but essentially doing everything possible to divide a society because they live off polarization. That is their political business model. I think this also relates to the very important gender question, that very often this is a tool to say, let's split a society, let's create a situation where it's either with us or against us, such that even people who are not actually all that crazy about the Modis and Orbans and Erdogans of this world, especially once these have been in power for a very long time, will feel like, okay, I got to choose sides, and maybe I'll still stick with them, even if I have some problems with that particular side. So that's certainly what Trump and Bolsonaro tried to do. They tried to culturalize questions about, do you wear a mask or not? Again, are you a part of the real people or not? By, showing these sorts of symbolic gestures. And that was obviously a disaster. But I'm not sure whether this is necessarily a good way of drawing generalizations about authoritarians or even populists in general. It also mattered that both of these were very inexperienced figures. Someone like Orban or Erdogan are very different. They know how an administrative state works. They're going to grab more powers as they have, but they're not going to be as crazy as Trump and Bolsonaro were in terms of all-out denialism, inject disinfectants and so on. So I know this is a very pedantic, boring thing to say.
No, not at all.
To generalize about this. And last footnote that maybe is worth bringing up as well. It's not entirely true that these figures didn't do anything but culture war. Because, sometimes people also said, look, they seem totally passive. It's so strange that, these are supposed to be also the future authoritarians. Why actually don't Trump and Bolsonaro grab more powers or do more? This is supposedly their Reichstag fire. This is the moment. But it's not quite true that they didn't do anything. What they actually both did big time, and this wasn't always noticed, is what they had been doing from day one of their administrations, which is to deregulate like crazy. I mean, Trump made sure that American companies can dump even more shit into forests and rivers and so on, and Bolsonaro did what he's already been doing to the Amazon, which leads me to my very last footnote to the footnote, if I may. We shouldn't entirely forget when we discuss populists and authoritarians that yes, these are very powerful forces in our era in their own right. At the same time, to this day, with a possible exception of Italy, no right-wing populist has come to power without the collaboration of established conservative parties and elites. I'm talking about Western Europe and North America. Other parts of the world are a somewhat different story. So the fact that figures like Trump and Bolsonaro also basically persisted with a, for lack of a cruder term, pro-business agenda that was very much backed by some of the people who had brought them to power, I think says something about these dynamics that became more clear during the pandemic. Anyway, I know I haven't really answered your question, but I hope it was interesting anyway.
Well, I think we're getting there, and I actually I want to come to the question of enabling factors in a moment, but let me perhaps just home in quickly on a point that you made earlier, which is I think what I'm trying to peel out here on in this aspect of the crisis, which is that it seems to me the difference between the successful populist and the unsuccessful populist is the quality of governance. In other words, what really got people through the pandemic with the consent of the governed was the quality of their decision making. And the ones who were inexperienced, who resorted to cultural wars among other things because they had no idea how to govern, and because they thought their mandate from their enablers was to rip away the fabric of regulation and the fabric of governance, were the ones that failed, right? And I think that's
a fair way of summarizing the point. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. And let me move to Ruth. Can you perhaps, again, drawing on your sort of historical knowledge of strong men coming to power as self-proclaimed saviors of their nations, can you add a little bit of historical depth to what we've just been discussing? Can you think of other crises that brought? I mean, I'm sure we can all think of some that brought strong men to power, and what happened then.
Yeah, I mean, authoritarians are, and here I don't think that all authoritarians are populists. Certainly over the arc of history. So I'm just going to use the word authoritarian for the moment. They are people who know how to manipulate a crisis. They're very skilled, whether they or not they had anything to do with that crisis breaking out, as in the Reichstag fire. They know how to take these occasions of instability, and crises open up states of exception. And this has been the case with COVID in a more sustained, extended way, where I think it was either Freedom House or VDEM Institute report showed a third of all nations passed, a kind of states of exception type laws or restrictionary laws without an end time frame because of the democracy, all kinds of political, across the political spectrum. But authoritarians, because their goal is always power and profit, and exploiting circumstances to get more of both, they historically love these moments, although and it brings out their impulses. So it's true. I agree with everything that Jan-Werner said. It is very hard to generalize. I've found this in speaking before on this subject, but the early impulses to manipulate belief. In the case of Trump and Bolsonaro, Trump, he was the biggest driver. He was the one individual who was the biggest driver of coronavirus misinformation in the United States. He was the New York Times did a study, something like 40% of misinformation came from him. And this goes back to the question of that, manipulating in the 21st century when massive genocidal projects are a little bit less common, and it becomes harder because everybody's a citizen journalist with their smartphone to pull off repression in some cases in terms of 20th century. Manipulating belief, manipulating information becomes even more important. And so this has been a factor. And so you see what their impulse was self-preservation. So they wanted to minimize. So, Trump said, well, we don't want to count the cases because that's about it. It will harm his perception, especially if they're up for re-election. And this goes back to they are also more dependent on perception and manipulation of belief because they have to stand for election today. So there's that part of it. I think that COVID has shown very viscerally the toll of bad government. And although that, as Jan-Werner said, that's difficult to measure, it's very difficult to make a clear statement that democracies have been good and other kinds of states have not. What we see is intention. And authoritarians, the secret of authoritarians who are so acclaimed and loved and spend so much effort and time creating these authentic personalities. Modi is brilliant at this on Instagram. The secret is they mostly despise their people. And this goes back to they're like Putin has perfected the parasitism. He's a parasite who feeds off the people and sucks the economy dry and, has imprisoned 70,000 businessmen. And so the myth of authoritarian efficiency, which I've written on a lot, comes face to face, collides with COVID. And the other thing we see that's very sad is the authoritarian, the scorn here, the lack of care. A global pandemic necessitates good leadership, which is also caring leadership. And that is something authoritarians can't deliver. And there's one phrase that Trump uttered in September 2020 that I will never forget it, and it chills my blood. He was told about the new death tolls, some kind of maybe it was 100,000. And he said, "It is what it is." And this phrase, "it is what it is," this response he had, spontaneous response, encapsulates a lot of authoritarianism. It's designed to make you feel hopeless, to make you feel there's no agency, there's no point in resisting. It is what it is. It's a flat, bleak landscape of history. And this is the authoritarian. This is what they want you to be, to just accept and submit to what the government does. And that's very, very sad, because one of the lessons of the pandemic has been how interconnected we are and how many heroes there have been, how strong civil society has been in a way to get through this. And it's a real laboratory. It has also so it's increased this kind of realization of how important altruism is, but it's also been a laboratory for the kinds of human impulses that lead people. The title of our panel is The Allure of Authoritarianism. So the impulse to fear strangers, the impulse to retrench each one in their own bunker.
Ruth, may I stop you for a moment and ask you if all that is true, if strongmen are as awful as you say they are, and as I think the three of us think they are, then what explains continuing popular consent?
I think we have to take the word consent with a huge grain of salt, because as we know from studies of propaganda, one of the first things that authoritarians take command of is statistics. So certainly for 20th century authoritarians, any kind of polls that show their approval ratings, are they very objective? How do we measure the consent? I mean, we can see the videos of the newsreels of them cheering, but I've written about this. We don't see what happens to the people who didn't respond to the postcard telling them that they had to come out and cheer. And it's very striking that when we Google, Mussolini or Hitler or Nazism rallies, we still see their own footage. We still see their own propaganda that comes up. And again, we don't see how those people were driven there. We don't hear enough about, and this is why I put corruption in the book, that in 1933 and in 1938, and 38's especially important because of Kristallnacht, Hitler had passed debt eradication laws so that he twinned reducing debt for good Germans, for Aryans, with accepting a heightened level of persecution for others. And this is the essential dynamic. We're getting far from COVID here, but I think that one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was to draw back the curtain on authoritarianism and this idea of consent. Plenty of people loved, I'm not trying to minimize the amount of people who loved Hitler and loved Mussolini as the savior of the nation, as the one who could bring the nation to greatness, as the one protecting, and this goes to contemporary populism, protecting the nation from enemies and being the one to take the hits. The strongman is always a victim.
All right. Thank you very much. Jan-Werner, I'd like to move to another aspect of this topic that you've already touched on, and that I think confounds so many of the critics of populism, which is the enablers. Who or what is to blame? Are we looking at the flaws and deficiencies of representative democracy and its ruling elites? Are we looking at adverse socioeconomic conditions, anxieties about status, culture, identity? What exactly would you pinpoint here? And again, you don't have to keep it to 280 characters.
Let me maybe make 2 points, which perhaps can also complement what Ruth just said. So when you look around the world today, it's true that in many countries, we see very similar patterns of far-right governance, what I've tried to call a far-right populist art of governance. And it's tempting to think that because of these similarities, because of these family resemblances, if you like, that the causes of these regimes must be similar as well. But I don't think that ultimately follows. I think in many cases, it's much more contingent than that. There are many factors involved. I'm not saying it's all random or mysterious, but again, it sounds very pedantic, but I think it's true that we would have to look at countries very closely and talk about the weaknesses of opposition, particular forms in which, ruling parties were discredited, how certain party systems like in Italy fell apart. I mean, these are also highly specific. sort of factors. But at the same time, and this is the point that maybe isn't so obvious, the similarities in the overall patterns of governance are partly explained by the fact that these actors can learn from each other. And I think this is, especially if we talk about history and learning from history, maybe that's something that's worth underlining. I don't believe for a minute that anybody in the 90s truly believed that history had ended. But I think there was a widespread sense among liberals in the widest sense that yes, democracies screw up all the time. We constantly make mistakes, but we are the only learning system. You know, we screw up, but we can admit the mistakes, we correct our course, and so on. And the authoritarians, I think it was often assumed, are basically stupid. And they can't learn from mistakes, and they're all going to end like the Soviet Union in 1991. And that was an illusion that I think has been disproven. I'm not saying these regimes are invincible or they're all super smart. That would be to buy into another kind of mythology. But if you think about the instances where one of these regimes has come up with a facially neutral law that, you know, doesn't look like it's really designed to intimidate civil society, or that doesn't look like it's designed to disable media pluralism, others can take note and they can copy it and they can say, yeah, that's a great idea. We'll sort of do the same thing. So I think it's this mutual learning that has played an important role in terms of, you know, explaining the kind of outcome we see. And secondly, and this hopefully finally goes more directly to your question, of course, we all want to learn from history, and it's a good thing too. But I think we often assume that only good people learn from history. But not so good people, if I may put it so bluntly, and I know this way I'll never get re-invited to this forum, I know, but I'll say it anyway. Not so good people maybe sometimes can also learn from history. So a lot of these regimes, and Ruth kind of hinted at this already, are very careful to avoid images that would all too obviously remind people of 20th century atrocities. And they also want to avoid situations where they really collectively have to mobilize societies, because that could generate too much resistance and too much dissent. So they're refining their techniques of, after often in very contingent ways coming to power, consolidating power, concentrating power, disabling an opposition, and so on. And at the same time, not being seen as too repressive. I think if you're in this category of people, you much rather want to be like Orban, where, you know, young Europeans flock to Budapest and they say, look, this is great. I mean, it's so much fun. It's such a hedonistic city. It feels so free. You're telling me this is kind of fascism. You don't want to be like Erdogan if you have to put tens of thousands of people into prison and, you know, beat up people on the street and cameras are there. That's not a good position to be in. So that's something that I think some of these actors have refined. They can learn from each other. Often they come to power on the basis of, as the, forgive the cliche, phrase tends to go, legitimate grievances. Not everything that all these people have ever said is, you know, automatically false simply because they've said it. When Erdogan talked about, you know, how Kemalists may have sidelined parts of Turkish society, wasn't all wrong. When Chavez said, look, Venezuela maybe isn't a perfectly egalitarian society, wasn't all wrong, but they've used this to get into power and then consolidate power, learn from each other. And last point, if I may, they've of course also very often benefited from the fact that opposition forces have been hopeless, you know, engaged in brawling, not being able to form a strategy, not really using civil society in the right kind of way. So yes, all the main blame is on these figures, but sometimes the counter forces have also not done a great job of really doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. It's time for us to bring in some questions, and I've got several here. The two from Heinrich Kreft and Claudia Döring. Heinrich Kreft at the Andrássy University in Budapest, former German diplomat. Hello, Heinrich. And Claudia Döring from the Thomas Mann Gymnasium in Oschatz, asking about the social media and technology aspect of populism. How does the usage of conspiracy theories and social media distinguish the modern authoritarian from the old model? Maybe you'd like to take that, Ruth.
Sure. I have an example in my book where Mussolini in 1939, he had been a journalist, and he was particularly, I called him, he never stopped being the editor of Italy. And he would call newspapers to dictate not only the headlines, but even the fonts they used, to micromanaging. But in 1939, he forbade the use of question marks in newspaper headlines. And this makes sense because authoritarians have to lock down meaning. You cannot have any doubt raised on anything because, quote, Mussolini is always right. And when we get to somebody like the Putin, the kind of Russian fire hose of falsehood model, one of the goals of 21st century propaganda is, which social media disseminates so beautifully, is to raise questions about everything. With some exceptions, the leader, of course, is off limits, but you want to sow confusion and doubt. You want to make the search for the truth not only dangerous, so that Putin, kills journalists, et cetera, and prisons anti-corruption reformers, but you want to make it exhausting, so people no longer know what to believe. And in this doubt, of course, and Trump followed this playbook very early, starting in 2015, when he raised doubt about links between immigrants and crime, that maybe they're much bigger. And I thought to myself back in there, I thought, oh, what's he doing here? This is different. And so that's one example. The other is that propaganda depends on repetition and saturation. And in old school dictatorships, you had the synchronization. That was kind of the word, the different forms of this word were used in different dictatorships. But you're able to have a total coordination of message because you have no real opposition. And today you give that up. You have even Orban, you leave some independent media, et cetera. So you don't have that, but social media allows you to disseminate conspiracy theories and your own party lines with astonishing speed. And it also turns what used to be passive consumers. So you read the newspaper, you hear the radio, and you couldn't really share except by word of mouth. Now, the average reader, especially politically motivated one, becomes also a producer, because they recraft through a meme or other, they share. And so this it soups up and accelerates this repetition and saturation that make propaganda work.
Let me come back to you, Jan-Werner Müller, and combine two questions. Here is Radu Harald Dinu from Jönköping University asking whether today's populists are trying to destroy democracy, and whether this will, like in interwar fascism in the 20th century, will turn to use of violence, use of paramilitaries, to replace a democratic constitutional order with a new one, or are they trying to hollow it out from the inside? I'm not sure that is, that there is a one-size-fits-all answer to this question, but I'd be curious to hear you explain to us where you think this is heading. I mean, notably, the AfD party program, which I'm sure you've had a look at, is not entirely clear on what it thinks the proper constitutional order for Germany ought to be, except that it rejects the current one as illegitimate.
Right. So very good, which is to say very difficult question. And to give myself a little bit more time to think about it, can I add one word about social media?
Please, of course.
Because I'm always a little bit nervous in these discussions, that especially since the double disasters of 2016, I think there's been sometimes a tendency to go down the path of technological determinism. So as one of our distinguished historian colleagues put it, Facebook is fascism, or a concentration on social media has given liberals in the widest sense kind of license to indulge all the sort of cliches from 19th century mass psychology about the great unwashed masses, because ultimately isn't that the problem with social media, that everybody can participate, no more gatekeepers and so on. And I think both are somewhat misleading, at least. If you look at the situation in the United States, I think empirically, many of our colleagues have shown very convincingly that, you can say a lot of critical things about Facebook, and they're all true. But if you want to explain 2016 and even maybe 2020, old media and decisions about deregulation, the end of the fairness doctrine, the rise of talk radio, things that way predate social media, formed a public sphere that, in the eyes of these scholars, basically became a self-contained right-wing ecosystem. And only for those people in that ecosystem was it even remotely plausible if somebody says, oh, Hillary Clinton might be having a pedophilia ring in a pizzeria in Washington. Because no matter how much you hate Hillary, it takes a long way to get to that sort of suspicion. And that would not have been possible without basically some old-style media figures who would not necessarily validate a conspiracy theory, but kind of, pass it on, hint at it, and so on. So, long story short, if you look at also some of the people we've been talking about today, old-style authoritarians, TV is still incredibly important for them. Print journalism in rural areas is still incredibly important for them. Yes, the social media discussion is very important, but we should not forget about these so-called old-style issues as well. And footnote, if I may, one thing that populists have been very good at, and this is where the internet actually does come into the picture, is to sometimes build up sort of counter-publics online, supposedly enraged ordinary citizens, who then put a lot of pressure on professional journalists and say, look, we think you all have lefty liberal bias. You first have to prove to us that you are objective and neutral, et cetera, et cetera. And this is, of course, something that Trump brilliantly used, the tendency among professional journalists sometimes to both sides an issue, thinking that this was the best way to prove, their professional credentials. And only towards the end of his reign did, I think, part of the American media realize that, look, this doesn't work. As our colleague Jay Rosen, I think, once put it, if you portray an asymmetrical reality, an asymmetrical polarization in symmetrical terms, it looks neutral, but it's actually a distortion. And it's a tendency that, of course, still continues as the American media is trying to come to terms with how to report on the Republican as an essentially, in many ways, anti-democratic party. Anyway, to get to the question, I think, contrary to what is sometimes said, populists are not inherently anti-institutional. It's not true that they will just tear everything down. I think this is sort of, again, a bit of a historical legacy that when we hear populists, we think, oh, it's got to be a guy with an open white shirt on a square in Buenos Aires with, thousands of people cheering, and that's populism, and that means all institutions and constitutions disappear. Someone like Orban has designed his own constitution, has designed his own institutional pattern that, of course, is also meant to diminish, if not abolish, pluralism, and that is meant to ensure that even if, God forbid, his party were to lose power, his people are going to stay in power, even if you have a different government. So I think this is again a kind of repertoire of techniques that others, if they have sufficiently large majorities, someone like Kaczynski doesn't have it. If he had it, I'm sure he would do the same thing. That they can do, that is another sort of tool in the toolkit of ensuring long-term power without doing anything that immediately looks like, oh, that's just sort of erecting a dictatorship. Because at the time when Orban was doing all this, there were still many jurists in Europe who said, oh, but that seems just like a sort of conservative type of constitution, that might be quite okay, and so on. I think these voices are not heard anymore, but even distinguished conservative German jurists for a while would say, yeah, that's okay, and that's national sovereignty, blah, 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 blah. And that's a path that, in principle always remains open, and that, they can go down. And none of this, I repeat, none of this has to involve large-scale violence or necessarily produce images which are going to remind everybody all too easily of the 20s and 30s.
Right. I think this is an extremely important point, that some of the current strongmen that we're looking at have successfully transformed their constitutional orders without violence and without notable public opposition. Although it's probably also worth pointing out that there is a groundswell of civil society opposition now, even in Hungary. which will be interesting to watch. But we're nearing the end of our hour, and I have two important questions I think that we do still need to discuss. And I'm going to have to ask you to maybe veer closer to the 280 character mark in your answers now. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, from Heather Graby at the Open Society European Policy Institute, is there an example of an authoritarian populist who has not used power to aggregate wealth? Is corruption always their weakest point? Can you think of one?
Not offhand. And I started a newsletter 2 months ago on the Substack platform called Lucid, and it's about threats to democracy. And the first person I interviewed was Bill Browder. And I twinned it with an essay on the myth of authoritarian efficiency. And Bill Browder said to me that he's found that it's easier to get to start to prosecute or expose authoritarians on issues of corruption rather than human rights. And the two are, of course, linked as they are under Putin, because it's very difficult to show that somebody ordered the massacre or pulled the trigger. But when they engage in corruption, they leave a paper trail. And this goes back to my initial point about we are not doing a good job to stop the flow of foreign enabling through financial institutions, international law firms. But all of these transactions they engage in because of their corruption. And Pinochet was one of he was doing this, he was exposed through his corruption. It was that made him lose his sheen, his allure with many of his conservative followers was the exposure of his corruption. And that's easier to trace and prosecute sometimes.
Right. Over to you, Jan-Werner Müller. Something we haven't talked about, and I regret that we didn't home in on that earlier, is the question of what needs to be done to make our democratic orders more resilient against their being undermined by populists. You recently wrote in a piece for The Guardian about the civic infrastructure of democracy, by which I think you mean the intermediating institutions between government and the governed, the representatives and the represented. But perhaps you would also say that something needs to be done about the order itself, in other words, the architecture of representative democracy, to make it more resilient?
So I think it's worth stressing this point about what I've been trying to call the critical infrastructure of democracy, which is to say the kind of intermediate institutions which ever since the 19th century were deemed indispensable for representative democracy to work, and in particular, but not only, political parties and professional media. And it's sort of become conventional wisdom that both of these are in crisis, especially with regard to the media, but also with regard to party systems. And very often, disintegrating party systems have provided a kind of launching pad for authoritarian populist figures. Now, it's often been said that, but, parties that's so old-fashioned, what about movements? What about, more civil society and so on? True. But if you look at some recent things in Europe, I mean, you don't have to like Podemos or France Insoumise or even Cinque Stelle. Nevertheless, if somebody had said 15 years ago that 500,000 people would sort of join these and say, well, I actually want to be part of a political party, they would have been laughed out of the room. So I think there is more life in the party form. It's a question of how it's regulated. It's very important to be internally democratic. Part of the issues with Trump, among the many, many issues, is that he, of course, made the party into a personality cult, didn't allow internal democracy, doesn't brook dissent. You cannot exhibit anything like critical loyalty. You're immediately branded a traitor. So that's a question of regulation. I hate to sound too patriotic, but if you look at the German basic law, how it regulates both the autonomy and to some degree the finances of parties, I think that can be a model in some cases. Same is true of media to some degree. But very last point, as always, follow the money. And of course, Europeans have a tendency to turn up their nose at the crazy Americans, 14 billion spent in federal elections last year. That's all insane. If you look at campaign finance in Europe, it's not so great either. And there are a whole range of proposals on the table of how we could start with these very, very basic things. And to, no panaceas as usual, of course, but that's where I would sort of use a democratic toolkit and repair things which are not always immediately about the issues, cultural, economic, and so on, but essentially about the instruments that we need to address these issues.
Thank you very much. That was a very helpful point to end on, which is that really the quality of decision-making processes about the financing and the regulation of intermediary institutions can contribute a great deal to keeping the populists at bay. And in some ways, this brings us back to the point of the quality of governance and the role of the state as a provider of public goods in a democracy, doesn't it? I unfortunately have to stop our discussion here. As always, I'm left feeling we could have gone on for hours. But I'm very grateful to both of you for participating in this splendid discussion. Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Professor Jan-Werner Müller, one in New York, one currently in Berlin, ordinarily at Princeton. And thank you to everybody who participated online and sent us questions, and to the Körber History Forum for inviting all of us and me ultimately to moderate this discussion. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you again at some point in real life. That would be wonderful. Thank you. And back to Gabriele Wojdelko in Berlin.